Today, I want to talk about double standards and the ultimatum faced by skeptics in the Bahá'í Faith. This is a news article from the Times of Israel. It wrote, Iran's supreme leader is urging Iranians to avoid all dealings with members of the banned Baha'i sect in a possible prelude to further crackdowns on the minority. So Ayatollah Khamenei, the supreme spiritual leader of Iran, has urged Muslims to avoid associating with Baha'is. And subsequently, as you would imagine, Baha'is have lamented the fact that they are the recipient of religious intolerance. But here's a double standard. If a Baha'i was straightforward enough to say, Azalis are heretics, and therefore we are obligated to shun them, which is true, and the individual hearing this would respond, what if your mother became an Azali? Would you no longer speak to her? Doesn't it sound cruel? To which the Baha'i responds, it's God's law. I have no say on the matter. Conversely, if a Muslim was straightforward enough to say, Baha'is are heretics, and therefore we are obligated to shun them, again, the individual hearing this would pose the same questions. What if your mother became a Baha'i? And so forth. And the Muslim would provide the same response. It's God's law. So, I hope the double standard is obvious, that it's okay for them to shun their heretics, but it's not okay for others to shun them. Right? It's only okay when they do it. So here's a scenario. If an individual who's a member of religion X, a hypothetical religion, were to mention to a Baha'i that female members of my religion are prohibited to vote, as in political elections, and the Baha'i would naturally respond, why? And the individual will respond, well, we don't know, but our religious leaders promised that the wisdom will be known in the future. Now, a Baha'i has two options. Either they can condone or condemn this religious teaching that is blatantly sexist. If a Baha'i chooses to condone, shrug their shoulders and say, it's not my religion, who am I to judge? Then the question remains, are religions permitted to practice sexism? Are they immune to condemnation? And if the Baha'i decides to condemn, then wouldn't the Baha'i faith also be worthy of condemnation? So for example, let's switch the scenario around. If a Baha'i were to mention to the same individual that female members of my faith are debarred from the top governing body, the individual hearing this would naturally respond, why? And the Baha'i would say, well, you don't know. But our religious leaders promise that the wisdom will be known in the future. See, same excuse. And again, same options. In Islam, as long as it doesn't violate the civil laws, a man can have up to 4 wives. And every time he gets an additional wife, he does not have to inform, he doesn't have to obtain the consent of, or even inform his previous wives. So let me just read you the quote. Furthermore, no evidence appears neither in the Quran nor Sunnah requiring the permission of the first wife if her husband wishes to marry another wife, and therefore he is not required to ask her permission. In another website, we know of no evidence suggesting that Islamic Sharia obliges the husband to inform his first wife of his intention to have a second wife. Refraining from informing the wife of the second marriage does not constitute deception on the part of the husband. So here's an example of a sexist teaching in another religion. And a Baha'i hearing this would have only 2 options. Either they refrain from criticizing it, right, as the saying goes, right, don't throw a stone if you live in a glass house, or the Baha'i develops double standards, where it's okay when we're sexist. because after all, our religion is a religion of God. Gender equality means equal opportunities, regardless of sex. I use an example that I talked about, the no consent polygyny. In fact, not only that, but they don't even have to inform them. It tends to be excused away as being divine, inscrutable wisdom, because after all, God knows best. Now, no Baha'i would accept this excuse. No Baha'i would be satisfied if a Muslim said, well, God knows best, right? Who are you to say anything? In fact, and if a Baha'i doesn't accept that excuse, then you can't use the same excuse to justify the male-only universal house of justice, right? Because then you just have a double standard. It's okay for us to use that excuse and not other religionists. And here's the actual correct model. That the male-only universal house of justice means there are unequal opportunities between men and women, and therefore we're dealing with gender inequality. And gender equality is synonymous with sexism. So the Bahá'í Faith is sexist. And the same model applies to the no consent polygyny, just how some religious denominations, they don't let women drive, or they only let men become political leaders. It's the same shit. You can't excuse it away. You can't justify sexism by saying that, God knows best, right? Divine, inscrutable wisdom. So here's some examples where we find different sexism and yet the same excuses. So if a Baha'i mentioned to an individual that women from my religion are debarred from the top governing body, and the person responds, well, isn't it sexist? And here's a common excuse I always hear. Men and women are equal, not identical. The problem with this excuse is that any other ideology can use it. So if a Muslim said women in Islam are prohibited to drive, imagine if the Muslim used the excuse, right? It's like, no, it's not sexist. Women are equal. Women and men are equal, not identical. See, no Baha'i would accept this. No Baha'i would accept this excuse. Another excuse is to say that whatever the women are being deprived of, in this case, membership to the Universal House of Justice, is a position of service, not superiority. And the problem with this excuse is that if Muslims used it, right, no Baha'i would accept it, right? No Muslim can, excuse their way out of it and say, well, driving, women sitting in the back is a position of service, not superiority. The last excuse is to say, well, God knows what's best. And again, the problem with this excuse is that a Baha'i wouldn't accept it from any other religion. Here's an interesting quote. The Guardian wrote, allegiance to the faith cannot be partial and half-hearted. Either we should accept the cause without any qualification whatsoever, or cease calling ourselves Baha'is. The new believers should be made to realize that it is not sufficient for them to accept some aspects of the teachings and reject those which cannot suit their mentality, in order to become fully recognized and active followers of the faith. In other words, either accept all teachings or GTFO. Now, interestingly, if someone declared, I'm a Christian and I support same-sex marriage, there is no central authority in Christianity that can declare the individual to be an infidel or non-Christian. Similar to Islam, there's no central authority. Now, some Muslims do engage in the practice of takfir. It's when they declare one another to be infidels. but there is no central authority. They're just merely exchanges of opinion. On the other hand, if someone said, I'm a Baha'i and I support same-sex marriage, there is in fact a central authority. So not only can they declare an individual an infidel, but they can have the individual excommunicated and shunned. And by shunning, it means that whoever contacts you will also be shunned, even if it's your immediate family members or mother. And it's not just supporting same-sex marriage. If the Baha'i contravenes any of the explicit teachings, like let's suppose it opposes the practice of shunning itself, or lying to people that they don't proselytize. I noticed that with skepticism, the moment you find a discrepancy, an inconsistency, you really have three choices. You either choose to conform, which leads to cognitive dissonance. So here's an example. We have conflicting beliefs, and they tend to pile up over time the more you do research. You could choose to remain a Baha'i and not conform, which leads to heresy. In that case, you're excommunicated and shunned eventually. So even your own mother won't be allowed to speak to you, or else she will also be shunned. And the third option is apostasy, which could lead to resentment, because after all, you spend so much of your time, in meetings and meetings about meetings, so much of your money, 19% of your surplus, not to mention the local fund, all the other fucking funds. So I noticed that apostasy is probably the best option, because with apostasy, not only can you retain all the lovely teachings, because Bahá'í Faith, not just the Bahá'í Faith, but any religion, isn't complete shit.